So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back for the next set of sessions, as afternoon sessions, for the Sub-Saharan Spectrum Management Conference. So we hope you enjoyed everything this morning, enjoyed the sessions that took place this morning, and I hope you were able to take advantage of the networking area that we had available. I saw that I think there were 25 new connections that were made in the time that we had available for networking towards the end of the last session. So really glad that you were able to use that, and I hope you're all able to meet with new people and connect in that way. So this morning's sessions obviously focused on the response from different countries to keeping people connected with COVID-19, and then we looked on to focus on the UHF band. Now, this afternoon we are now moving on to focus on the issues around universal coverage. So looking at basically the delivering a coordinated strategy towards universal access. So we have two sessions. First of all, we're going to be having a keynote presentation from Andrew Rugeji, who's head of the region in Africa from ITU. And Andrew will then introduce three different presentations looking at different funding and technology options to help deliver the goal of universal access. And then following that, Andrew will stay with us, and we're then going to be having a panel with representatives from different sub-regional groups throughout Africa to talk about the views from those regions and the different approaches that are being taken there. So really interesting session coming up again. I can remind everybody that we do have audience polls running. So please use the polls tab on the right-hand side of your screen to access and to vote on those. And also the chat room is obviously running again. So please do put your questions and comments for the speakers in the chat room, and those will be passed to the speakers, and the moderator, Andrew, will be putting those to the speakers and panelists, and we'll be looking to respond to those during the session as well. So please do get involved in that way, and yeah, make your voice heard as well. So without further ado then, I would now like to say a very warm welcome to the stage to Andrew Rugeji. So Andrew, I'm sure, is somebody who needs no introduction at all to any of you. He is, of course, the Regional Director for Africa at the ITU. And Andrew is going to be delivering a keynote presentation, first of all, and then following that, we'll be moderating our next two sessions. So Andrew, welcome. It's great to have you with us. And I'll pass over to you, and we're looking forward to hearing your keynote presentation. So over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, absolutely. Loud and clear, Andrew.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear?
Okay, now I can hear you.
Perfect. Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to Dan for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. So let me say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, wherever you are in the world. It is really a pleasure to have this opportunity to engage with you in the conversations around this virtual 5th Sub-Saharan Spectrum Management Conference. It's odd to be speaking to you like this. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first Sub-Saharan Africa Spectrum Management Conference that is online. Over the last few days, we heard what an Africa Spectrum strategy might look like. We looked back at WRC 19 and its outcomes with very, very lively discussions. And we looked at how much more influential the African voice needs to be in WRC 23. We also examined the coexistence of satellite and mobile services in certain frequencies, particularly the 3.6 gigahertz to 3.8. And today, we are going to discuss delivering coverage and connectivity to societies everywhere. I believe that this is no coincidence that all these discussions that were held in the last 2 days, all these conversations converge and lead to our unenviable and collective task of connecting the 3.6 billion people now still offline. With all the death and loss of livelihoods that came with COVID-19 pandemic, Corona has put the spotlight squarely on the vital importance of digital technologies and services, but also on the startling digital disparities. Those who know ITU is not only the specialized agency of the United Nations for ICT and telecommunications, but it also has several mandates organized in different bureaus. It also has different mandates. It has the Standardization Bureau with the mandate to make standards and ensure interoperability of devices and services in this ICT and telecom space. We have the Radio Communications Bureau, which is charged with our radio communications assets, the space assets, satellite space assets. It is the central registry of all satellites in space. It is the one custodian of spectrum. So we also have the Development Bureau, whose mandate is bridging the digital gap. And it is this bureau particularly that I see most in Africa. I see because the gap in Africa is most blatant, I guess. So it is vital. It is of vital importance that digital technologies and services come together for Africa and bridge the digital divide. Being online in these times of COVID-19 has made a big difference for me and for others who have relied on information and communication technologies to work, to study, to care for others, and to keep in touch with loved ones. Personally, every week I have a family get-together with my children who are in different places of the world. We have had weddings. We have had celebrations of other forms which would otherwise have required us to travel and be with those loved ones. But there are those that haven't been so lucky, and we'll be talking about those a bit later. But let me say that it is recorded that 1.3 billion children have had their education interrupted. And the majority of these children are in Africa, as you know. And this is not a comfortable feeling. And that is why the spotlight that COVID has put on us shows the glaring gaps that we have. Bridging this gap is not a one company, a one government agency, or even a one country job. It is therefore necessary for all stakeholders to look at innovative approaches, both financial and technology-wise, and the need to work together in order to extend connectivity to the hardest hit and hardest to reach in our rural areas. Those who have been to Africa and those who have traveled around a bit will know that we probably have the most difficult terrain, and I'm sure somebody will mention that in the interventions that will come. but it also means that our rural areas are a bit more alienated than in other places, and hence difficult to reach. A recent report from the United Nations Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development, which is headed by ITU and UNESCO, estimated that about $9 billion is needed to double broadband connectivity by 2021. 2021, this coming 2021, not any other. It is very, very close. And also, it estimated that $1 billion would be needed to achieve universal access for broadband connectivity in the year 2030. To address the elephant in the room, we need to step back. We need to step back and reflect on what will universal broadband access take? Connectivity infrastructure and technologies, the required enabling environment, the digital public goods, and affordability of digital devices and services. Then the financing options and technology discussions can follow. So, what exactly is appropriate technology for connectivity? And which technology is going to be the most agile, the most usable, the most beneficial? We have, I have now lost count, the number of submarine cables landing on Africa's shores. Has this made a difference? Yes, it has made a difference. But is it really bridging this gap that we are talking about? Is it adequate to achieve or to help us achieve universal access? Is Facebook, that has just announced another submarine cable landing, is Facebook going to make a difference? We have, for connectivity, optical fiber cables, and we have copper wire twisted cables. We have these now in a lot of African countries, but we still fall short. I don't know how many satellites, and I know there's a discussion about this, how many satellites are in the sky with coverage over Africa. And yet, we do not have universal access. Why? I know that we can run, or some places run from backbone to different places off that line through radio microwaves. We have many of those, but still not enough. We have emerging technologies, we have Wi-Fi, we have Li-Fi even. There is laser beam that is coming. We have 5G knocking at our door. Are these emerging technologies going to bridge this gap of universal access? We have mapped from ITU, we have digital transmission maps that show us where in Africa we have what kind of connectivity. We have electronic maps that show where fiber is. We have maps that show where we have more radio microwaves. We have maps even that will show where we have towers. But how can we use these maps to inform what we need to do towards universal access. We have towers everywhere, but still there is a problem, and I'll mention what problem that is. Leaving connectivity alone, we probably need to discuss also what enabling environment is needed. We shall be talking about money, as I said, that's the elephant in the room, but we first of all need to address what enabling environment is needed, what policies we need, what legislation even we need. Are these in place? Do we yet have inclusive and fifth generation regulation that we need? Because we need to be talking about regulation before the regulator actually puts in place. Otherwise, we are back in the last 10 years. Do we have the right broadband plans in place? Do we have policies of inclusion? Because this 3.6 billion that is offline, more than half of that is either gender biased, it is people that have disabilities, so we need to have, to be able to have true universal access, it needs to be inclusive. Now, I know you are probably tired of hearing this word, spectrum. Do we need to be having discussions about spectrum with respect to its role in ensuring universal broadband access? I think we do. We need to be talking about an environment that nurtures investment. Do we have that? Do we have partnerships, the necessary partnerships that we need to have? Can we have either individual, syndicated company syndicates, or even country syndicates to tackle the problem of universal access? We do need an all-of-government approach. Let me give you a fascinating example that I recently had. We have an initiative in ITU called Smart Villages, and this has been piloted in Niger. It's been very successful with 2 villages and is now upscaling to another 20 villages. But the trick to this has been an all-of-government approach. We'll see in a little bit how I think this all-of-government approach is the only way that will work for us to succeed in universal access. What about digital public goods? It is no good to have the connectivity and even have people accessing it without content. We need to have contextualized content for people that are in the rural areas to see or to benefit from the internet or even locally distributed content. And this is an issue that I also think we should consider. Do we need to have international connectivity to the internet for everybody all the time? Or should we be looking at having contextualized content in-house or in-country that can be synchronized on off times when the networks are not busy? Do we really need to be, do students, for example, do health workers, for example, all the time need to be connected and therefore this international bandwidth becoming a problem. So, towards that elephant in the room, affordability. Affordability of internet, affordability of devices is still elusive in Africa. Investments are made as short-term investments seeking short-term maximized profits. And I know what I'm talking about because I've been in African private sector before. Most are putting their own infrastructure in place rather than infrastructure sharing. And again, I've been there. I know about that. I know about the selfishness. I know about putting stumbling blocks in having somebody else use your infrastructure. But we cannot stay in that mode if we want to reach all of our people with connectivity and universal broadband. Universal service funds have largely not worked, and I know you will agree with me. But why? Why have they not worked? We know that there are countries sitting on millions of dollars, and yet they have rural areas that are not connected. Why? We know that governments that end the year with shortage of money and they turn to the regulator or the Universal Access Agency and find lots of money there. And they say, okay, we'll take this because we need it now. It's because you didn't use it. What is the problem? We have worked with different countries on their universal service definitions and modified them to include broadband. In most cases, it was not included as one of the things on which broadband funds could be spent on. Spectrum. Spectrum sales are still regarded as cash cows in Africa. Well, this may be a problem elsewhere as well, but in Africa, it's also a big problem. If we want universal access, and if we know that to get to the rural areas, there's certain spectrum, certain frequency bands that are needed, and yet we want to sell them at such a high price, the operators step away instead. Is that the right way to go? Governments, our governments, African governments, are still not treating digital infrastructure as critical infrastructure. It is my hope, and I don't need to front this in front of our governments, but I hope that COVID has shown the importance of having universal broadband access. In the Digital Cooperation Report to the United Nations Secretary General, it has been said, we suggest an initial goal of marking the UN 75th anniversary in 2020 with a global commitment to digital cooperation to enshrine shared values, principles, understandings, and objectives for an improved global digital cooperation architecture. Now that's telling. I really hope, and I know that the UN Secretary General is really passionate about this issue. So I hope that this is one of the recommendations that they will take. But it is telling to us, to African countries, to African governments that are responsible. We need to commit these enshrined shared values, principles. We need to commit to understandings and objectives. We need to take advantage to make sure that in the 10 years that we have left, we can we can have universal access. So I don't want to be too long, but I do have food for thought. Considering the cross-cutting nature of digital infrastructure, can this be regarded as an all-of-government endeavor and have all ministries contribute a small portion of their budget to universal access? And here I'm talking about the Ministry of Agriculture realizing the value of having access, broadband access in their farms, in the rural farms, and being able to apply certain things for food production.
Sorry, I was just wondering, I mean, there's some really interesting points. I know it's a food for thought you're providing. I was wondering whether we could maybe come back and address some of these issues in the Q&A possibly. I think we're running a little bit behind now. So I was just wondering if that was possible, and we can maybe move on in a second to the...
Sure.
Thank you.
I thought you were going to give me an alert, but I didn't see.
Okay. No worries. No, sorry. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Just in 1 minute, should infrastructure sharing be universally mandatory, as in some countries? Should we be looking at employing government bonds on infrastructure, on digital infrastructure? Should countries trenching fiber cables at the sites of infrastructure like roads and railways? The rest we can discuss in the panel. I thank you all. Dan?
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, so I really appreciate that, and I think that set the scenes perfectly for the conversations that we're now going to have. So thank you very much for that. So I'd like to now then pass back over to yourself and maybe to introduce our first speakers. So I'll pass back over to you. And
actually, I lost the names on my. I don't know which file. Can you introduce them, please?
Yeah, absolutely. No problem at all, Andrew. No problem at all. Well, look, we now have three fantastic speakers who are going to be talking a little bit about some of the financing, the funding, and the technology options. And first of all, I would like to welcome to the stage Eleanor Sarpong. So Eleanor is Deputy Director and Policy Lead at the Alliance for Affordable Internet. And Eleanor, welcome. And I know you're going to be talking a little bit about finding the required funding to deliver universal access. So without further ado, over to you, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Andrew, for setting the scene. I was just nodding my head as you were speaking because I just understand, the challenges you've spoken about, and all the issues regarding coverage and the partnerships that we seek. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I wanted us to also step back a little and look at why spectrum is important. Spectrum in itself, by itself, would not mean anything if it's not looked at from the point of view of coverage, digital inclusion, social mobility, and all that that comes along with it. So it's important that as we speak to the issues of spectrum, we also look at why it's important and the usage of it as well. So I'm going to be speaking mainly about advancing affordable and meaningful connectivity in Africa. As Andrew has mentioned, this is very important if we really want to achieve universal coverage by 2030. And then also look at some of the funding options that we can explore in this conversation. So next slide, please. So let's step back and look at what the state of internet access is in Africa. And as you can see, there's an online population. These statistics are actually from our affordability reports that we release every year. This is our annual flagship report at the Alliance for Affordable Internet. And this indicators here from 2019. So we will be releasing the 2020 report in 2 months' time. So please look out for that. But the online population in Africa, there's 28%, and that's people who have some access to the internet. And then you have mobile internet subscribers, that's 34%. And then in Africa, it's very important to look at also the internet use gender gap. So we have one of the Africa and South Asia has one of the widest internet gender gaps, digital gender gap. But if you look at the internet usage gender gap, it's about 50%. Now, when you look at Africa as well, in terms of countries that have affordability, so when we look at countries that at least people can afford 1% of 2% of their annual average income can give them 1 gigabit of data. You look at countries where this is possible. There are 10 out of 45 countries where people can, they're spending not less than 2% of their average monthly income on 1 gigabit of data. But it's important to note that just because a country has met the affordability target doesn't mean that everyone in the country is able to afford the internet. We've seen so many instances. We look at South Africa, 80% of people cannot afford the internet. So it's important to look at the lower quintiles, to look at those in the lower income groups, and you realize that there are quite a number of people, shockingly, who are unable to afford the internet. Next slide. So one of the key things that we've been exploring over the period is about what kind of access are we looking at. We are talking about universal coverage, universal access, but basic access or access just in itself is not enough. We need to raise the bar to be able to show that if we are going to use the internet meaningfully, the kind of access that we require has to be meaningful. So it's meaningful connectivity. And as COVID-19 has shown, you can't just have any kind of access. Mediocre access won't cut it. We'll not be able to have this video call or have conferences or do homeschooling with very basic or mediocre internet. We need to raise the bar. And we are looking at least 4G type speeds kind of connectivity, regular connectivity, and the connectivity that you can also access with a very appropriate device, and also unlimited data. That is when if you have a combination of all these, then you can say that you're having meaningful connectivity. And that is what we need to strive for 10 years from now or 5 years from now, depending on which country, because it's important to also look at how people are able to use the internet and also gauge how they will be able to contribute meaningfully if they have the kind of access that's important. Now, we do understand that in order to achieve this kind of 4G target in many countries, and even to ensure that people have the unlimited data and the fixed broadband or whichever technology that they can deploy, it will cost some money. And it's important to explore what the funding options are and what the gaps are as well in order to move forward. Next slide. So what would it take for us to have universal access by 2030? And we did some research together with the ITU, and this is some of the results. It's going to take over close to $430 billion for us to be able to get that universal coverage, or at least 40 billion on year on average. And if you look at this as the visual here, you do realize that network operation and maintenance, that's it's about 140. So this is an existing infrastructure that is in place that needs to be upgraded or maintained. You have the CapEx for mobile infrastructure, and a lot of the infrastructure components that are needed are tied to the rollout and maintenance of broadband networks. So it's very important to understand that kind of infrastructure need. But what's also important is to look at the policy and regulations that are needed. And often we tend to overlook why this is very important. You can have, if you want to have all the investments in that you require, you need to have the enabling environment. And therefore, it's important for policymakers, it's important for those of us in positions where we can engage to speak to the issue of the importance of the enabling environment policy and the right policies and regulations to open up the market and make it more competitive. Next slide. So the investments needed in Africa to achieve universal access are also very clear here. We did some work with the UN Broadband Commission and UNESCO, as Andrew mentioned earlier. And if you look at the statistics that we're showing here in the visual, you realize that network operations and maintenance, again, as very similar to the global picture, is also shown here with infrastructure capex. And it's going to cost us, at least for Africa, you need $9 billion for us to double connectivity by next year. And when we did these estimations, we had not thought about COVID. So naturally, we're looking at what the variance is going to be by 2021 because there's been a big hit in the global economy, and naturally that has also affected Africa. But yes, by 2021, if we really wanted to double connectivity, we need 9 billion. And if we really wanted to reach universal access by 2030, we would need close to $109 billion. Now, these amounts sound so astronomical on the surface of it. But if you think about it, most of the investments that are happening in Africa now, about 50% of those investments are coming from the private sector. And governments do pick up some of the tab in some of the infrastructure and other areas. But where the biggest opportunity is in the area of partnerships. And I'll speak a little more to that as we go along. But again, the importance of having an enabling environment to support the kind of partnerships that are required for us to have the universal coverage that we need are very important. Next slide. So one source of funding that we've heard about and which has been given quite a bit of a bad rap has been a universal service funds. And we've done some research in that space, which will come up shortly. But these funds are still very important. I mean, there's a contribution into a pool, so usually by either utility companies or telecom companies. There's a percentage that goes into a common fund, which is then used to deploy infrastructure and other services to unserved areas in various countries. Now, what we've noticed, as in the next slide, as you would see, is that a number of these funds are sitting unused. And it's really sad to see that. We did some research on this about 2 years ago that looked at various countries and looked at how well their funds were being used. And what we noticed is that in the Universal Service and Access Funds, 37 African countries have Universal Service Funds set up. So that's a good thing. But what we realized is that there were 14 countries that had inactive funds. So the law had been, legislation was probably in place for you to collect the funds, but it wasn't continuous to dictate how the funds were going to be disbursed. So that was problematic, actually. And also we weren't sure how these funds were being invested. And then you had countries that had no information. And that's just a big problem because not having data, not having open data also creates a problem with transparency on how these funds are being disbursed. And so it's important to note that while this is a huge funding opportunity for to be able to create investment in rural areas, to be able to partner with companies and other MDBs in order to increase infrastructure, not having that properly set up fund, not having a properly managed or administered fund, and not having much data doesn't really help. And as you can see from the next slide, you notice that about 400, what we realized through our research was about $408 million of these funds were sitting unspent. That's a lot of money. And if you can think about it, this is money that could go not just to infrastructure coverage and access, but also could also help with digital skills. And for us at FOIA, one of the things that we've really championed and advocated for through our research was that this amount of money could go towards closing the digital gender gap. And we believe that universal service funds should be able to dedicate at least 50% of their collected funds to be able to do this. Because if we really want to have universal access, then we need to make sure that those who are most likely or most vulnerable or most marginalized and likely to be left behind come on board. There's no point trying to win a match if most of your good team members are being benched. So it's very important that we look at the disbursement of these funds and also see how we can use them to close the digital gender gap. So the next slide, please. So how can we improve the situation? I mean, we talked about the need for coverage and why partnerships are very important. And if we really want to take the bull by the horns, then we need to do some drastic change. And that's going to come not just from policymakers, from government. It also has to come from the private sector, rising up to the occasion. It has to also come from civil society, holding both government and companies to account as well, and citizens also being more interested and demanding more transparency. So if you look at the policy and regulatory change, we need to look at how our new legislations for universal service funds, or even for digital economy and private sector and for the communication sector, can also embrace new technologies. We've got new technologies now with Wi-Fi, we've got complementary service providers. We need to make sure that spectrum is available to them as well, and not just to the mobile companies. And so the kind of policies and regulations that we have in place need to be looked at and see whether they are forward-looking. We also need to have develop good strategic partnerships. It's not just enough to have between companies, but there are a lot of great PPPs that are going on now, which between governments either building the backbone of a networks that operators can then come and use, or also removing all the hurdles in the space so that you can have more private sector players also going and stepping up to the plate, and then also the MDBs. Again, there's research that shows that about 1% of funds dedicated to communications and the technology space is not being used. And so it's important that we look at that enabling environment to make that happen. And then finally, we also need to look at monitoring and accountability. I talked about transparency of data, very, very important. We also need to look at data disaggregation. In all this that we've spoken about, it's important to look at how data can be disaggregated. So if you're speaking about spectrum to rural areas, how much of that is actually helping people to be able to close the digital gender gap? It's very, very important. So let's look at issues that can also cover those points as well. So the next slide, please. So I wanted to end with two very good examples of how this has worked, universal service funds have worked. And one example from Ghana, which is one of the countries A4AI works very closely with, is on the strategic partnerships in action. And in Ghana, you find out that the Universal Service Fund does a lot of removes all the bottlenecks that come in. Sorry, just a minute. I need to mute something. Remove the bottlenecks that operators tend to have a problem with, and it's important that you look at what they take care of the permitting. They remove they also offer incentives, the customs waiver for equipment as well, and then acquisition of making sure that you can piggyback on some of the existing utility companies. So by removing the hurdles, the multiple permitting, you actually create an opportunity for investors and for telecom companies to come in. So it doesn't necessarily, the USF doesn't necessarily have to provide the funds, but by removing all these bottlenecks and offering the carrots and incentives, it really helps to encourage operators and investors to also seize this chance. And I believe we'll hear that from Huawei as well, who have got a fantastic partnership with GIFEC and MTN in Ghana. Secondly, I wanted to also speak about the importance of policy. And you see that in the next slide in Mozambique, if that can come up shortly. Yes. And in Mozambique, you notice that we work closely with the Mozambique government to revise their regulation on universal service funds. Previously, you can only access the funds if you're a contributor. So that meant that it was only telecom companies that were able to access the fund. But fortunately, with the revision of the regulation, it now embraces complementary service providers. And now you've seen that in Mozambique, they actually have launched digital squares, which are funded by the Universal Service Fund. So this is another opportunity that takes care not just of the technology, but also for the funding as well, by creating an enabling environment. So in all, it's very important for us to look very carefully at all the factors that affect coverage. And so policy, very important, partnerships, very important, and funding as well. Also, key moments for us to come together in order to be able to bridge the digital gender gap and also the digital divide in Africa. Thank you. So Andrew, I think that, you know, I was just echoing a lot of the things that you were speaking about.
Okay. No, it's great. It's great. Oh, Dan is back. Okay.
Did you want me to introduce the next speakers, Andrew? Would that be?
Yes, please.
There we are. No problem at all. Well, Eleanor, thank you very much. And yeah, some really, really interesting points there. And I'm sure we'll come back to those in the Q&A part of the session. But for now, then, I would like to bring up our next speaker. So we now have Bello Musa from Huawei, and Bello is going to be talking to us about more of the technology options and looking at things from that side. So Bello, over to you, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, and very good afternoon to the listeners. It's a pleasure for me to be part of these conversations about the universal connectivity. As the previous speakers and the moderator mentioned, it's a very, very important for people to get connected at this particular time. Funding's, of course, very important, policy equally important, but the main element is the technology. So I would like to share these few slides with the audience about our thought and the position about the technology choice for the universal coverage. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, of course, connectivity is very, very important. There is no way we can emphasize this enough. 5 years ago, the ITU set certain KPIs. The most interesting one was to reach the 90% population coverage broadband in the rural area by 2020. So just for a reminder, 2020 is just a few months away to end. How much of this target we have been reached? I believe we have done a lot of work, but a lot is still to be done. We haven't reached 90% of the rural population coverage, not only in Africa, but I believe almost all around the globe. Next slide, please. And this pandemic era has exposed the digital divide like never before. We have seen the big gap in the access of broadband infrastructure, especially between the urban and the rural areas. I still remember this image that I've seen on TV during the pandemic, how certain children in villages in Africa just rely on the radio to attend classes, to listen to the lectures or classes that have been dispensed to other children in the urban area who have connection to internet. So this is just one of the very, very painful example of the lack of connectivities in our rural areas, and of course this ever-growing digital divide in this particular era of a broadband. Next slide, please. So there are still millions of people not covered. And the sad reality is more than half of that is in our continent, in Africa. And the disparity is so huge that is alarming. Certain countries have penetration of broadband to more than 100%, whereas others are still lagging behind. When you consider the previous technology, 3G, 4G, the connectivities or the penetration is still very, very low compared to the global, positioning of the broadband access or broadband connectivities. We move to the next slide, please. And based on our analysis, there is a very, very reason for the lack of connectivities in the rural areas. The main issue of the lack of connectivities in the rural areas can be classified into different categories. We can see the environmental aspect issues, no grid in the rural areas. The terrain is so difficult. The transportation of the equipment is very, very difficult and hard. The villages are scattered around the countries, the populations are sparsely distributed. There is also a big issue of ecosystems, the terminal, and of course the affordability. And because most of the time in many countries, operators are the main contributors to the development or the extension of the mobile coverage in these areas. And for them, the most important thing, of course, is to look into the return of investment. So according to our research, rural site, when it comes to the CapEx or OpEx, is very, very high, sometimes thrice the cost of the deployment in the urban area. And because of the low affordability or low business cases, the ROI is very, very long. Let's look at the next slide, please. So if we look at the cost involved in the deployment of a mobile coverage, it will split it into CapEx and OpEx. The civil work, the energy is a big concern, and also the power consumption. Looking at the CapEx, because of the nature of our continent, sparsely located villages, we do not have access to the optical fiber easily. We rely to other means of transmissions, such as satellite, which cost could be, relatively high compared to, of course, the traditional microwave that we could have used in the urban area. And because of some logistic, the time required to deploy site becomes much longer. And operators, they really think twice before, embarking into the rural coverage initiative. So what can we do about this? There is a huge requirement for the coverage of the rural area, but we also have all of these challenges, which of course will impact the progress or accessibility of the coverage in the rural area. Next slide, please. So we have to look into some optimum solutions for connectivities for the rural area and our ecosystems. So, of course, we have been working very, very astutely in this aspect, in this regard. We have tried so many options, and luckily we have come up with certain type of solutions which are innovative and very cost compared to the traditional solution. And the logic behind the solutions is very simple, is to try to find alternatives into the costing element of the traditional base stations. For example, the tower, the energy sources, the transmissions or relay equipment, and the possibility to also provide some cheap and affordable and also adapted devices terminal for the rural area. And above all, we also have to look at the content, provide provision just to enable the local rural people to be able to access the internet, access the content of the internet. Next slide, please. So, well, as you can see on this slide, one of the solution is just based on the in-band relay solutions, where we have, simplify the actual settings of the traditional base stations by replacing some of the element. For example, for the transmission, we can of course use the in-band, relay solutions based on either LTE or 5G for the transmission. Instead of tower, we can use pole, steel pole, or even wooden pole. And believe me, this was able to save the cost of the deployment for almost 70%. And for the energy consumption, we use a solar energy, which is a very good alternative for the diesel generator that we could have been used into the traditional settings. Next slide, please. So, based on our studies and experience, we believe that the hybrid access technology will be very, very important to realize the universal services. When we look at the settings of our continent, urban and rural areas alike, operators are, of course, focusing their investment in the urban area. Certain countries, we have access to fiber, which makes the connectivity or the broadband penetration or dissemination in the rural area much easy. So fiber can be used, and that can reach around 60 to 80% of the population because it's on the urban area. While the mobile technology, 4G and 5G, can also be used to provide between 20 and 30% of population area, and that geographical area to more than around 80%. And when you compare the cost of the deployment, the CapEx is low compared to fiber, and the OpEx is, of course, medium. And the satellite can be used for the more remote area access, including some lower densely populated rural area, and it can provide some basic internet access only, not high-speed broadband access, and can be able to cover around 5% of the populations and support around 10 to 20% of the coverage. So the choice of the technology, the right technology, is very, very important. And two aspects has to be taken into the consideration about the cost and the availability of the technology and the affordability of devices, the terminal, and the services. Next slide, please. Yes, as the previous speaker mentioned, we have a very interesting case in Ghana, where the government pledges to cover almost 90% of the rural populations by within 2 years. So we explore different technology, different solutions, and at the end we came up with a very feasible solution with very low capex, around 50 to 70% saving compared to the traditional solutions. And within 3 years, the operators were able to recover the cost. So these are the kind of solution that we believe could be very, very important and very beneficial to deploy for rural coverage in our continent, in Africa. Next, please. So I will not stress this enough. The previous speakers has mentioned it. It's not only about funding, about technology, but again, regulations and policies are very, very important. Commitment is very, very important. Around regulation around spectrum's allocations, universal access and equality, a favorable, environment, infrastructure policies, infrastructure sharing, ecosystem development, and the funding is very, very important. The correct use and collection of universal access funds and the government intervention into the whole ecosystem, some tax and incentives, tariff monitoring, and of course a collaboration with third parties, with OEM to provide affordable access and affordable devices. So this is the content of my presentation, and thank you very much, Dan, for the opportunity again. Thank you.
Bello, thank you very much. And again, really fascinating presentation. And I'm going to bring Andrew up as well. And really fascinating presentation. And I think it's great to not only look at some of the funding options as we have done, but now to, as you've done there, move on to look at some of the technology options as well. So, so thank you very much for that. So, Andrew, shall I move straight on and introduce our next speaker? Would that be perfect? So, so Bello, thank you very much again. So our next speaker now is Laith Hamad, who is speaking on behalf of ASOA. So Laith is Global Spectrum and Regulatory Policy at ASOA, and he's going to be coming at it from a different technology point of view. Excuse the noise in the background there. He's going to be coming at things from a different point of view, from the satellite side of things. So Laith, over to you, and looking forward to hearing your presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for hosting me, and it was really an interesting discussions these few days. Looking forward for continuing the discussion as well. So I'm representing ASOA, and I'm going to present on a coordinated strategy towards a universal access. I will consider in my presentation different technologies and their associated funding details. So let's go to the next slide, please, so we can start. All right, so obviously Sub-Saharan Africa is really a huge territory, not only as all, but also most of the countries are huge. And that's, of course, represent a challenge in connectivity, especially in areas where population density are really low, which could not justify the investments for some of the technologies to reach out and cover those areas. So, so if you notice in the map, the population are scattered. Most of the population are in around or over big areas. I would say Sub-Saharan Africa really has the widest coverage gap in broadband connectivity. And as per the GSMA figures, there are around 300 million people remains outside of the mobile broadband coverage. And currently around a quarter of the total population, only quarter of the population are connected to the mobile internet. So obviously coverage represents the challenge, and coverage is also directly connected to cost. Next slide, please. So here we consider what are the options that could provide connectivity to Sub-Saharan Africa. As I always say, it is not only one technology could provide connectivity and coverage. It's not one technology could bridge the digital divide. It's always a mix of technologies. So, and the policies around broadband connectivity should be really focused on supporting a technology neutrality concept. So any particular connectivity option or technology could fit in a particular area should be used to cover that area connectivity. So the first technology I'm going to present on is the fiber. So as we see in the map in the previous slide, of course, laying fiber over a huge area is challenging. It's cost prohibitive. It is logistically impossible. And I would like to echo what my colleagues Andrew has just mentioned in his introductory remarks, that Africa has a territory, so it's not easy to lay down terrestrial infrastructure. And it should be justified. It should be commercially feasible. So many factors goes to that decision whether to invest or to fund a particular option to provide connectivity. And I believe now there are around half of the population, or 45% of the population, they live more than 10 kilometers far from the nearest fiber point. Another option of connectivity is the fixed wireless access. Again, infrastructure obviously is an issue. There is a lack in ICT development. There is a lack in roads to build the antennas in order to provide connectivity and reach places, as well as the power grid network, which is required to supply the operation of these networks. So it could be an option to a certain extent, but not in the millimeter wave, I believe. As we all know, the lower bands could be used quickly and cheaply to deliver an alternative to wired broadband. But the millimeter wave, and when you go higher and higher in frequency, the wavelength is becoming shorter, and it's a pure physics. The penetration through buildings and materials become lower and lower. So this type of technology is also could work perfectly for an outdoor connectivity. But in the millimeter wave indoor connectivity, there are a lot of question marks here. The mobile industry, of course, plays a vital role in connecting Africa. But for when you go outside the city, it's extremely costly. So it could not alone cover or provide a universal access. So it needs, and considering the area as well, it needs hundreds of thousands of kilometers of a new fiber across the region. So you can put the mobile stations and provide the backbone for this mobile connectivity. And the last option is satellite. So there are huge investment in satellites that are already made, and some of them are still under progress, which covers Africa. And again, to come back to what Andrews mentioned about how many number of satellites covering Africa, there are so many satellites, more than 50 satellites in the C-band alone, covering Africa. There are many more in KU and KA bands, and so many more to come when the NGSO constellations are online. So satellites is also an option to be considered when we speak about universal access. Next slide, please. So how satellite could be an option? We believe it fit perfectly for a rapid rollout broadband in Africa, because the infrastructure is already there, whether on ground or in the sky. So you can directly put the antenna set up the connection. It could support backhauling as well for mobile operators to provide a mobile coverage. It could work in whatever way possible, like direct connectivity to homes or to businesses. It could work for community Wi-Fi's and hotspots, and it could also work for connection or mobility connections. Next slide. So here I will speak about satellites and figures. So over the last few years, there are huge multiplications of number of satellites increments. So there are 77% increment in the number of satellites only in the last 5 years. We have an average of around 350 satellites per year is launched, and that's obviously because the new constellations in the LEO. But as per now, we have around 560 satellites which are active in the geo stationary orbit. Those are geo satellites, and as well, of course, there are the throughput satellites in the MEO orbit. Those are obviously O3B, and the coming era for the LEO constellation is also coming, I would say, in the near future. There are a few satellite operators are planning thousands of satellites, in their constellations. OneWeb, SpaceX, Telesat, and Amazon, few other companies as well are planning. So whomever is successful at the end, and those systems, when they are operational, they could also support universal access in Africa. Next slide, please. So in this, I will speak about capacity, and that's somehow linked to funding to funding a satellite industry in order to support the universal access. With the technology advancement now, you have a lower cost, and at the same time you can get maximum capacity when you manufacture a new satellite. So now in the geostationary orbit, we have 33 commercial geosatellites under contract. So it will come in the coming 4 years. This will add a 6.5 terabit per second, and that will nearly double the current in-orbit geo capacity. For the NGSO constellations as well, there are a proposal of I would say 4,000 satellites to be built in the coming 4 years out of 15,000 proposed satellites. So those are not fully funded yet, but it will also add a huge capacity to the available capacity pool over Africa and worldwide. Next slide, please. So here in this slide, we see how cost is connected to how cost and capacity are connected. How in advancement in technology manufacturing could offer more capacity and less cost. So in the satellites which were launched between 2013 and 2019, cost of capacity has been reduced by 85%, and on the other side, capacity has been increased by 145%. On the other hand, the cost of high throughput satellites as well in those years has reduced by 80% to manufacture those satellites. And on the other side, we have more than 4 times the capacity are increased. And that's obviously a very attractive way to look at it, to invest in these constellations and help fund the universal access. Next slide, please. So what are the funding drivers when you invest in satellites? So increasing productivity increasing productivity and the new capabilities are also are really changing the satellite industry dynamics. So we have a huge demand now. There has increase in telecom capacity. When I say telecom capacity, it's also the mobile terrestrial traffic, which could rely on satellite connectivity for cellular backhaul. There are huge demands. There are a big projection in the near future. So demand is there. Satellite manufacturing capabilities, as we spoke, the capacity and the cost are also developing. We have more capable satellites for less cost, and we have now also a geo life extension missions, which have been recently proven with the latest. I believe it was Intelsat 901 satellite when it was successfully given a life extension or in the satellite fuel to continue for more years. So there is also a robust ecosystem in the satellite industry, from manufacturing to services demands to launching capabilities, which are now for much less than it used to be. Ground equipment technology are also developing. So this robust ecosystem is also supporting funding into satellite constellations. Next slide, please. Done. So as a conclusion, I would say, as we mentioned in the first slide, Africa obviously has this widest broadband coverage gap. Satellite technology, together with other technology options, would support solving the universal access problem. We really rely on regulators to help protect the C-band, the Ku, Ka band, and even in the future the Q and V bands for GSO satellites and NGSO satellites. So that's conclude my presentation, and I also, of course, remain happy to answer any question.
Thank you very much, and once again an absolutely fascinating presentation, and obviously looking at things from a different industry perspective and looking at the role that satellite can play. So thank you, that was really great to hear that. Now I'm going to bring Andrew back up here now. Unfortunately, we are running a little bit behind schedule, so I don't think we have time for any questions for our three speakers so far. I know we have had some questions in from the audience, so what we're going to do, if it's okay, we will forward those questions to the speakers off and separately from the conference, and they'll be able to respond to those offline. So apologies, I know we're running around 20 minutes late, and we do have the panel which we want to move to now. So apologies that we don't have time for those questions. We will forward those, and hopefully we can hear back from the speakers offline. You can hear back from the speakers offline, so we'll forward those over. What I would like to do just very quickly is bring to the stage all of our speakers, though. So I'm going to bring back up Eleanor, Bello, and I'm also going to bring our three panelists that we have for the next session. So Sarah, Mawuli, and Tony. So bring everyone up. Now I'm going to drop off the screen in a second, because I think it's fantastic to have such a diverse group of representatives from industry, from the different regions, from an NGO, and obviously Andrew representing the region as a whole. I think it's fantastic to have so many of you here with us discussing these issues today. And I'd just like to maybe just have a quick photo. Now we do things, I say photo, it's probably be a screen print that we'll have to do. So we'll do that in the other way. So I'm just going to drop off myself, and we'll just do that very quickly. And I think just to mark the occasion of having so many different groups here discussing this obviously hugely important issue. So I will drop off because I'm not the important one here. And I'm going to leave you up here just for a few seconds. We'll take a photo and then we'll move on. So 1 second, please.
I don't know, your eyes were closed.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, guys. I think that was the time to get a good photo in there. So I just think that was worthwhile doing. So thank you. Thank you very much for that. So what I'd like to now do, I'll pass back to Andrew in a second. But first of all, I'd like to once again say a huge thank you to Eleanor, to Bello, and to Life for those fascinating presentations. And I think I'm sure they've given our panelists for this session now a lot of food for thought and things to think through. And as I said, we will forward over the questions you had. and will allow you to go back to them on those offline. But guys, thank you all so much, and really appreciate your time and your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that said,
Thank
Andrew,
you.
I'm going to pass back to yourself now. Gishad unfortunately hasn't been able to join yet, so we're hoping that Gishad is also going to be joining us. But we have here, as you can see, we have here Sarah, Mauli, and Anthony. So welcome, guys. So what I will do, Andrew, I'll pass back to yourself to introduce each of the panelists. So I think each of the panelists has introductory remarks. I know that Sarah and Tony, you have a few slides, and Mauli has some introductory statements. So I'll pass back to you, Andrew, to introduce each of the panelists, and then we can move forward and have a discussion as well. So thank you, guys, and looking forward to it.
Let us know if you think we are running out of time. Huh?
I will do. I will do. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, let me give a shout out myself to Eleanor, Bello, and Leith for the excellent case studies that you have given. I think they've given us food for thought. So I need to welcome Sarah Kabahuma, liaison manager of ICT East African Communications Organization, IACO in short. I also want to welcome Mauli Amoa, Program Officer, Telecommunications and Networks, ECOWAS. And I want to welcome Anthony Chiganzira, Executive Secretary of PRASA. Hopefully, Gishad Sangu will join us shortly. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have had quite an inspired account of affordability, technology choices, financing choices, but now it's our turn. In view of the regions, in the view from the regions, from the representatives that you were, will probably give us a better insight in the strategies that you are employing for delivering universal access and the importance of working together. I think throughout the whole theme of connectivity and universal access, we've heard that working together is very important. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Sarah Kabahuma of IACO. Please tell us what IACO is doing in terms of their strategies delivering universal access. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rugege, for that introduction. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Forum Global for this platform they have created for us to discuss pertinent issues that are taking part in our region. I come from IACO, East African Communications Organization. We are a regional organization that brings together the 6 East African countries to promote ICT in the region, which includes telecommunications, postal, and broadcasting. Today, I'm going to try and say what it is we're doing at IACO, or what is happening in the different East African region countries in regards to the connectivity gap. Yeah, we can move to the first slide, please. For me, and even at IACO, the question is, no, the issue is everyone matters. And this has been echoed in the past 2 days that we've been talking, and in many other ICT forums. When it comes to connectivity, everybody matters. And one thing that this season has shown us, the COVID-19, is that more than ever before, we need ICTs. We need to be connected. We need connectivity, we need broadband, we need satellite services, we need fiber. That's what this season has shown us. Our healthcare needs connectivity, our schools need connectivity. I could go on and on. But the question remains is, what of the unconnected? In today's statistics, I think Mr. Rugege mentioned that the 3.6 billion are offline. And then another statistics, about 30% of Africa is not connected to the internet. And at the heart of what we do, I think for everybody on this forum is what of the unconnected? What is it we're doing to have everybody connected? Can we go to the next slide, please? And sorry, but what are the challenges that what challenges are we facing in East Africa? The challenges in East Africa are not any different with many other parts in the region, in Africa as a whole. We have infrastructure gaps. And this is brought about by a number of challenges. We have a country like Tanzania. It is a very huge country. Connecting that country costs a lot. So there are obvious infrastructure gaps. Even Kenya is a big country. We have terrain challenges. If you've been to Rwanda and some parts of Uganda, it just goes in. It's a winding infrastructure, winding roads, winding hills and mountains. So having that connected is a challenge in itself. There is also the challenge of cost and quality. This I experienced a few weeks back, trying to get connected to one of the webinars. A 3G connection was not enough. I had to pay for more. So the cost of connectivity is still high. There is also the ICT skills limitation. Many of our young people need to get digital skills. And I think this is still a huge challenge in our region. And it's cutting across all the 6 countries. Yes, some countries are better than others, but generally there is a skill set that is needed. And there is an energy problem on our continent. In some documents, it indicates that 30% of Africa is not connected to the grid. And you see how this is synonymous with the 30% that's not connected to internet. So there is a need these are some of the areas where there are gaps and they eventually affect the connectivity. And something that has been echoed over and over again when it comes to the unconnected is the lack of a business case. Why should I take a connectivity to rural Uganda or rural Kenya or rural Tanzania or in rural South Sudan? The business case still remains, still needs to be, right? There still is no business case. Next slide, please. But amidst the challenges, there has been, East Africa has worked to ensure that we are working towards ensuring that connectivity is there. And one of the obvious things is license obligations. In some licenses that are issued, there are coverage obligations. I think this in itself has enabled us to get to where we are, to ensure that areas get covered, where the licensees say, I will go here, and the regulator comes to see, have you actually gone there? So these coverage obligations have helped connectivity to be achieved. Then there's the Universal Access Fund. The previous speakers expounded a lot on the Universal Access Fund. And in each of the East African countries, there's an entity that is managing the Access Fund. And some of the programs that are cutting across in the initiatives of the programs, we have rural connectivity. I wish I could get some numbers and statistics. There is rural connectivity in one of the things that are happening. And I think the regulator is engaging operators to see that they go to these far-to-reach areas. Then there's also upgrading of sites. I think this is happening in Tanzania, upgrading 2G to 3G sites or even to 4G. So this fund is being used to do this. And also there are a number of broadband connectivity campaigns. I think in 2019, there were 22 sites which were connected. I think Uganda partnered with MTN. The regulator in Uganda partnered with MTN to have broadband sites connected. And there have also been a number of digital literacy campaigns. So on the whole, in each country, there is a fund that is being put to some use. And I could also say South Sudan had their fund established in 2018 and it's up and started running in 2019. So this has been a big source of funding to ensuring that especially those in the rural and those areas which are not connected are able to get connected. Next slide, please. And there are clear examples which have been happening in the East African region to show some clear examples to ensure that connectivity the connectivity challenge is addressed. We have spectrum assignments that are taking place. I could say the 800 megahertz has been assigned, and this helps with long distance coverage and, of course, rural areas coming into play. Last year, Tanzania auctioned the 700 megahertz band, and I think at the heart of this auction, it was to reach the underserved areas. There were clear coverage obligations in that auction. There have been Wi-Fi hotspots for free internet. This is an initiative that Uganda took up, I think, a few months ago. At border areas, they have put up Wi-Fi hotspots to have free internet. And not to go without saying, we all know the M-Pesa success story of Kenya. And amidst this COVID-19 pandemic, many of our economies have encouraged going cashless. I think right now, Rwanda is really on a drive to have a cashless economy, and the incentives to have mobile money in use. And many of our government, Then we have device plants to bring the cost of devices down. There's an assembly plant in Rwanda. In fact, Rwanda has something in regards to this, and also Uganda has something on devices. And this is all geared to bringing the cost of these devices down. And at EACO, we have a number of strategies we are working on. One clear strategy we have is a digital inclusion strategy. We have a draft document that's out, which we want to have our members adopt so that they can use this to ensure that the connectivity gap is addressed. And a number of work is going on at EACO. We want to promote satellite technology in the region. So we have a concept paper that we have developed to ensure that we can grow our satellite industry. And then next slide, please. So approaches we have, for me, the take home here is these approaches we can adapt. It's not a one size fits all. We'll have to adapt different technologies, 5G, satellite, eSIMs, hubs, etc. And also, we need to address our regulation. We need to move towards something that's a light regulation, create an environment that is enabling. And also, we need to review our approaches. Yes, we've had the Universal Access Fund. Every country has it. I want to call for a discussion whereby we review what is it that we are doing in our different countries with this fund. And also regional harmonization. At EACO, regional harmonization is at the heart of what we do. The African proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, we go together. So for us, regional harmonization is pertinent to the work that we do at EACO. And this is for us to bring all the countries to move, to create opportunities for all the countries. And lastly, there is a multi-sector approach. I'll not expound this further, but we all know that ICT industry alone cannot work alone. We need to work with others. In conclusion, next slide, please. For me, the take home is we need to review our current approaches and methodologies in regards to bridging the digital divide, and work towards and see what it is we can do differently or better. And lastly, the numbers matter. For us to appreciate or benefit from the digital transformation, it won't be one household or a few people. Everyone needs to be connected. And that's the way East Africa and everybody will see the benefits of that digital transformation. I thank you for listening to me, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's inspiring to know what is going on in East Africa through EACO. And I'm glad that you have started to deploy auto-assigned 700 megahertz for longer reach. I'm glad that you have a plan for digital inclusion. I'm very, very impassioned about that, not leaving anybody behind. I'm promoting light licensing and light regulation. We call it 5th generation regulation. And yes, we need to move together as Africa. The numbers matter. Thank you very much. And if I may, I would like to call on Mauri Amor, Program Officer, Telecommunications and Networks of ECOWAS. Mauri.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon, Sarah, Anthony, everybody listening and watching from wherever you are. I'm very pleased to participate in this 5th edition of the Sub-Saharan Africa Spectrum Conference. I did participate in the last edition last year in Botswana. I was really looking forward to meeting everyone again, but we of course know the current circumstances. But as much as the onslaught of the pandemic has really brought things to a slowdown all over the world, I think that it has provided the opportunity for the use of ICT to permeate across all sectors of our economies. In line with that, that really has brought to the fore the necessity to have digital inclusion of all populations, so that all our citizens, wherever they are, will be able to partake and contribute effectively to the economy. And then that has also brought to the fore and revived the discussions around universal access and service to ensure that at least everybody has some basic level of access to ICTs, to ensure they can also, partake in everything that we do. I think Sarah did speak about regulation. I think was also mentioned by one of the earlier speakers from Huawei. My opening statement is going to talk about laying down the policy foundations which are necessary to unlock the funding and technology options that are necessary to achieve the aspirations in universal access. So coming back from the global scene and coming home to the ECOWAS region, our ECOWAS's objective in ICT is the creation of a single digital market. And then to do this, one of our most important pillars is the harmonization of policies and regulatory frameworks. So far back in 2007, we had an initial set of harmonization initiatives, and then the area of universal access and service was one of the areas that was looked into in this harmonization. There was a supplementary act on universal access and service, which was adopted by the Authority of Heads of States and Governments of the Economic Community of West African States. And this act spelled out and gave guidance to member states on areas on how to set up universal access institutions and funds, what kind of projects could be funded with these funds and things like that. Over the years, with the help of the Alliance for Affordable Internet, my good friend Eleanor, who was on earlier, we carried out an assessment in 2017 on the effectiveness of the application of this supplementary act in the member states. While some successes and achievements were noted, we also realized that there were some challenges related to the implementation of universal access, some of them notably around the effectiveness in the disbursement of the funds and then in the institutional frameworks of the organization set up to administer these funds. There were also challenges with regards to monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of the interventions that these funds were being used for. So we therefore, based on but irrespective of all these, the feedback was that universal access is still very important to achieve policy objectives in ensuring the digital inclusion of populations. with that in mind, the ECOWAS Commission, with the support of A4AI, undertook a review of the Universal Access and Service Supplementary Act, which was this revised act was adopted in October 2017. The revised act basically sought to review or provide guidance on having a strengthened institutional framework, also provided guidance on the kinds of projects that funds could be used for, was also revised to basically expand the kinds of areas that the funds could be using to add broadband access, because the initial act was talking about things like ensuring that there were payphones in every community, and we all know that today mobile has overtaken fixed in our region and continent. So it sought to update the kind of technologies that the funds could be used to support. It also try to spell out how the funds could be used to support targeted interventions in underserved communities, unserved communities, especially marginalized groups, and for the promotion of local content. Since the adoption of this revised act, we've seen some good progress, some good applications in many of our countries. An example is Ghana, where they have the Ghana Investment Fund for Electronic Communications. I think one of the speakers, they speak about the project for rural connectivity in Ghana. Nigeria also has a very vibrant and active application of the USF. The Nigeria Universal Service Provision Fund has been instrumental in undertaking lots of projects for local connectivity, inter-university connectivity, provision of national backbones, and supporting e-health and e-accessibility solutions in the countries. So there is still a lot of opportunity for us in using our USFs wisely to ensure that the digital divide is closed. But whilst we continue to try to adopt newer technologies, whilst the focus seems to be more on adoption of technologies to ensure access, my concluding point will be that we should not forget the second level digital divide, which also needs to be closed. Sarah, they speak about numbers, about how we need the numbers to ensure that we are making strides. And GSMA's latest statistic in the West Africa region shows that as at end of 2018, only about 48% of the population of West Africa was connected to a mobile network. Whilst the issue in some areas, or in most areas, is affordability, there is also the issue of motivation and the lack of local digital content, which would encourage people to get onto this digital networks. So my closing remarks in this opening statement will be that whilst we are continuing to use or to explore the various technology options to ensure that every person within our countries, our sub-regions, and the continent is connected to a network, we should also be very much committed to ensuring that we support and develop and encourage a creation and development of local relevant content, so that we have a holistic solution for implementing digital inclusion, rather than just extending access without having the supporting services for this access to be able to reach. Thank you very much, and I'm available for
Thank you very, very much, Mauli. It's very, very inspiring to know what is going on there. Particularly those funds that are in Ghana and Nigeria, I think we probably need to reach out to them and find out a bit more, because I think beyond universal access, a lot of countries could be doing other more innovative reach outs. So thank you very much. I would now like to call on my friend Anthony, Executive Secretary of CRASA. Anthony, what's going on in Southern Africa?
Thank you, Director. Thank you to the Forum Global. I hope I'm clear, because I can see that my connectivity is up and down. Thank you very much. I think for starters, it might be essential to just give a perspective to the way SADC is organized, so that maybe participants can understand better where we are and where we're coming from. Because SADC has got implementing agencies, of which CRASA is one of them. So we implement the programs that have been enunciated by the heads of state, and below them, the ministers of ICT take ownership of the programs, and then they are given to SADC Secretariat and us to implement. So we implement these programs. So what has happened with CRASA, we came up with the roadmap, which was approved by the SADC ministers of ICT. And this roadmap is it covers universal broadband access implementation, and it includes broadband targets. So our roadmap was prepared as far back as 2015, and initially it was obviously it was meant to harmonize the broadband access in the region. So with us, we're not just talking about universal access, but we went a step further to say universal broadband access. That is what we're looking at, not just universal access or just connecting everybody, but making sure that we connect everybody to broadband. They've got access to broadband. So we came up first with the guidelines in that roadmap. First, we were supposed to come up with guidelines for national broadband plan. And then secondly, all member states were supposed to come up with the national broadband plans and strategies, which are drawn from the guidelines that we produce. So they domesticate the guidelines and come up with their own plans. And they're supposed also to establish universal broadband access gaps, which are supposed to be in place. That we did through some partner. I think it was GSMA who helped us identify the broadband gaps, with especially the mobile technology, but they couldn't extend that assistance to other technologies. And we're supposed also to come up with monitoring and evaluation mechanisms for universal broadband access. That is something that is in place. All member states were supposed to come up with a broadband access policy statement and strategic plan. So next slide, please. So this is what I will dwell on mainly. And next slide, please. So I will not really talk about much. I will not talk much about the funding options in our region, but suffice to say that the PPPs we are working on, and personally, when I was director, I used to be operations director commercial director for Tier 1 in Zimbabwe. I personally used this a lot, the PPPs, and also what we called customer finance projects, where the customer funds, because they've got a need, they fund the projects, whether they're a mine, then they benefit all the schools downstream. Then the USAF Universal Service Access Fund levies, that is the one that I'll dwell much about because it's very, very popular in our region. It is a major source of funding. But I just wanted to mention one peculiar one in our region, which I've seen in Botswana particularly, is some form of crowdfunding where everybody contributes something. They've got something called Mutu le Mutu Komo, which they use to fund other projects. And it's something which can be adapted for the region, but it's not yet, that is not yet the case. We can move on to the next slide, please. The next slide. Yes, within our region, we have members who have come up with Universal Access Service Fund levies, and not all of them have come up with this. We noticed that we've got 8 members in CRASA, members of CRASA who have this fund, and they actually have a provision in their legislations. And however, I think instead of 60 now, I think it's 7. We have ongoing projects. Zimbabwe who are still to embark on the project using the fund, but I think they've got some projects as well that are lined up, and they are still to report formally to us. I'm just aware because I know what is happening there, but they have not reported formally. But actually, we can say pretty much all of them are using the funds to develop the infrastructure, and they've also put in some USO obligations as a licensing condition in most of the countries. And the way they levy this one is 1%. Typically, it's 1% of the gross revenue of an operator. That is generally what they're using in our region. Then I also want to mention that there are some particularly interesting projects that are being funded with this Universal Service Fund in our region. Like Angola, for instance, they've gone into infrastructure sharing in the rural areas. They've also used the fund to provide tablets in rural schools, and they're building internet centers in rural schools using the fund, whilst Botswana are deploying infrastructure for public Wi-Fi hotspots, and they are providing upgrades and deployment of 3G and 4G base stations in rural areas, and they are using the fund for closure of voice network gaps along the major highways, and also for expansion of private radio transmission to rural areas. Then in Eswatini, we have seen 3G and 4G network in rural areas, tablets to schools and students and government center connectivity, and also public Wi-Fi, hotspots in strategic places. And in Malawi, they've got a number of projects also, as well as Mozambique and Tanzania, Zambia. They are constructing communication towers, connectivity to learning institutions, and ICT equipment for persons with disabilities. So there is a lot of projects that is happening. Next slide. In our region using this USF fund, and the aim is to make sure that the underserved areas receive connectivity. Next slide, please. And what we notice as major challenges in bringing the stakeholders together is that we have noticed there's need for cross-sector collaboration when we are deploying networks, because it's not just one sector, and bringing those parties together is not very easy. And we have also seen the need for collaborative regulation, because ICT cuts across virtually all sectors. And in deploying networks, we have realized that there is need probably for other sectors to be involved, and need for single information project information for the project, because that information, when it is available, it promotes transparency, one-stop shop for investment, and also it makes it it makes it possible for investors to access crucial information without problem, because there is need for dig once policies to be in place and all that, and power and everybody else must be well coordinated, because at those sites there's need for power, there is need for other infrastructure to be in place. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So what we noticed now in implementing these universal service policies in our region, the main challenges are on the geographic terrain, because in our region we have mountainous areas, like in the Kingdom in the Sky, that is Lesotho. There's deserts, there's thick forests like in DRC, and the high infrastructure deployment costs due to lack of roads, no access to public power grid, and then low demand, because most of this is in, we notice that it's according to business cases. So if there is no demand, then there's very little justification. And also the need for monopolistic practices to be curbed by especially the incumbents. Next slide, and next slide, please. So in our region, what I just want to mention is that, yes, there is a lot that is happening. Yes, we've got challenges with utilization of spectrum. That is why we try and harmonize, harmonize even the channeling arrangements for the 700 and 800 megahertz bands, because we have realized most countries were doing their own thing. But now when we harmonize the channeling plans, we at least improve our situation in terms of availability of the low bands. Well, the low bands are the ones that are needed for coverage, especially for coverage. They are very good for coverage. So what I just wanted to emphasize is that in our broadband targets that we came up with, the main issue was we had to align them to the Broadband Commission target. That is the Connect 2020. And even when they amended them, we also amended our targets. And what I want to emphasize is that we have said, okay, whilst they want 90% for our region, noticing where we are, we've said, let's go for 80% of the population in member states being covered by broadband. We want at least 80% of the rural areas to have entry-level broadband services, be it fixed or mobile. That is by 2025. And we also want 50% of the households in our region to be connected to broadband. So these are the key things which I wanted to emphasize concerning our target, what we have done in our region as members of CRASA and as SADC. And what we are appreciative is that in our region, there is a lot of support right from the top leadership, the political leadership, because of the way we are structured. We are assisted by partners who have helped us come up with the broadband plan strategies. We have assisted us also with capacity building, and we appreciate particularly the ITU and a few others who are on this platform. I've seen them on the agenda, who have come in a big way, GSMA and the like, who have come in with the assistance of the gap analysis. So as a region, really.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just conscious that we're running out of time. We only have about 15 minutes left or so in the session now. So I just wondered, it's really interesting the points you're making, but if it's possible for you to wrap up now, we can maybe address some of these points. We have lots of questions from the audience as well, and I'm sure we can come back to some of these points in that, if that's okay.
Okay, that's fine. Sorry about that. I got carried away because
No
yes,
problem.
there's a lot. But in summary, I think what you've said is we have recommended to the government inside to consider the urgency of a healthy, competitive ecosystem and supporting policies, because we have always seen that we are very strong on regulations, but on the policy text, we didn't have enough. So we have recommended that there is a policy predictability and regulatory certainty, among other things, and at least measures to stimulate ICT investments, such as tax relief, subsidies, continued subsidies, and infrastructure sharing policies supported by policy. Well, in a nutshell, I would say no. That is really some of what we're working on as Southern African region. Thank you.
Anthony, thank you so much, and apologies to have to cut you short there, because it was really interesting and it was great to hear what you're doing in the region. But I've just seen we have lots of questions coming in, so wanted to find time to address those. So I'm just going to bring back to the stage now Andrew, and also Sarah and Mauli. Andrew, you'll have seen that we have a lot of the questions which I put into the chat here. So you have those, and I've also added the poll results in there as well. So we have about 15 minutes or so left for conversation. Unfortunately, Guishard wasn't able to make it and wasn't able to join us. But we look forward to hearing hearing the discussion now, and I'll pass back over to you for a bit of discussion around some of the themes that have been raised.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan, and thank you for putting the questions in the chat. So consumers ultimately decide how they want to consume content and/or services. Content providers are perhaps simply afforded an alternative transmission means to deliver content to consumers via mobile networks. I'm not sure what the question is here, but whether consumers decide how they want to consume content, I don't think we have a choice. But Mauli, what do you think?
Yes, I really think it's the services we consume is a mixture of both demand and supply. Obviously, there are services that we find out there, and then we get to use, and we end up finding that, okay, this is really good for us, and we just stick with it. There are also services that we need in order to be able to consume with our lives. For example, in the advent of the pandemic, lots of our younger ones have resorted to online education, e-learning via lots of different platforms. So that's an example of the services that consumers need, the ones that they are making the demands for. So in my opinion, it's really a mix of demand and supply, and then it's up to providers of services to really do the research and look into what services consumers be needing at any material time, to make sure that their lives are improved and they are able to partake more effectively in economic activity, etc.
Okay. Do you have an opinion on this, Sarah?
That one I'll pass to Cluster.
Well, I could, thank you, through the chair,
Okay.
I could just mention that what is typically happening is that if you have relevant local content, if that is available, then the demand for ICT services is stronger. But what we are seeing is that connectivity in all the areas, yes, we are promoting, but if they have no local content, they end up just using for WhatsApp. That's all. And in which case, then it appears like it's not really important for the area to be to be connected. But if they are accessing market information about the product, soil, about the soils that they have, and where the prices of the commodities in that area, and all that information, then you find they've got a stronger demand for connectivity. They've got a justification for connectivity, and even a business case is easier to build, where the information, the content, adds value to the business. Thank you. I don't know if
okay. Okay, the counter question that I would ask would be, when you go online and you only have a limited amount of bandwidth and you are bombarded with these adverts, what is there anything we can do? Because we know Google is free, but if you're out of your minute or so, you have half of that advert. Is that the way you want to go? But that's not the question that was asked. So I'll go to the second question. Is there an opportunity for an Africa-wide single universal service fund for Pan-African projects? Very interesting question. So let me, okay, Sarah, did you?
Yes, I can comment on the second question. I think there is an opportunity, because I think if we have, I think it's always better if we work together. Working in our silos will not harvest much. I think if we work together, the impact will be even greater. I think the challenge we have here is probably the dynamics of how we can do that, because I think probably we haven't thought through the intricacies of how we can have a universal service fund for the whole African region. But I think this is a really brilliant idea, because if we work together, the impact will be even greater. Yeah, thank you.
Good. This is actually addressed to Sarah. Excellent reminders of the challenges. To what extent is IACO as a sub-region looking at 5G, and how do you see IACO countries benefiting from infrastructure manufacturing? That's from Bashir.
All right, thank you, Bashir, for this question. I hope I can give you a clear picture of what's happening. Yes, I think East Africa is looking at all technologies, but I think currently we have more of the 2G, no, the 3G, the 2G, 3G, and 4G. I think most of the broadband is at 4G. But 5G, it's an interesting time for us. I think discussions are ongoing on how do we go around 5G, how do we implement it, how do we assign the spectrum. Discussions are ongoing. I think the different entities, the regulators, the operators, are looking at how do we move forward with regards to 5G. And I can say for a fact, I think Safaricom in Kenya has, I think, rolled out something in the 5G, there's something to look out for. And at IACO, I think we want to look at maybe having a 5G strategy. What is it that we're going to do at the East African level? I think we need a 5G strategy as a region for us to know how we move forward, and also move forward with clarity on what is it that we want to achieve, what is it that we want to connect, who is it, what speeds are we looking at. And also a comment, what is happening at national level, there are broadband strategies. I think different East African countries, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, have a national broadband strategy. I think this also speaks to 5G in the region. I think last year Kenya got a digital footprint, something like that. So all this documentation shows that the countries are working towards ensuring that we can have a broadband and ultimately 5G. And then the next part is how do we benefit from infrastructure manufacturing? I'll look at this from economies of scale. I think if we can have harmonization in the region, whoever is producing this equipment will benefit from economies of scale. And when I saw this question, in my mind, I looked at it more on the basis of if we can have this equipment manufactured locally, I think it will bring down the cost. But I think most of the equipment coming into our region is very expensive. Yeah, I think I have seen some of the quotations. I think I used to work for an operator. The quotations were on the very high side. I think we should work around seeing that manufacturing is brought in our region. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think you're absolutely right. I don't know whether I did, but I had wanted to bring up the same issue on collective manufacturing of devices, probably syndicating countries to manufacture, and maybe this can be the same thing. However, with the sensitivity around 5G equipment, it is still a dicey problem, because not all big players see it the same way. We have another question. Do the sub-regional ICT team need to share best practices, and if so, how often? Well, I have a meeting next. I have the Regional Development Forum for Africa is on 5, 6, and 7 of October. That's a platform and meet to discuss best practices, but there may be others as well. Anybody has any input on that?
Yeah, if I may add to that. If I may add to that, Andrew. Yes, so the revised Supplementary Act on Universal Access and Service in the West Africa region actually makes provision for an association of universal service providers in West Africa to meet and collaborate and share ideas and best practices on the provision of universal access and the utilization of the funds. Actually, in this year, Benin was meant to organize in June a maiden forum on universal access, on best practices for the disbursement of universal access funds, but unfortunately, due to the restrictions imposed due to COVID, that wasn't able to take place. But we hope that once the restrictions are relaxed and once the world is in a better place, they will still be in a position to go ahead with organizing that forum. So yes, that is something that in West Africa we are trying to institutionalize.
Thank you. Quickly, in probably half a minute, Anthony.
Okay, I just wanted to add that at African Union level, we used to meet occasionally, once every 6 months, and we used to have coordination meetings. I don't know if they will continue after COVID, but they were very helpful in terms of migration of best practices. And we can actually ensure that this particular area, which currently is being done at sub-regional level, like in SADC, we do have sharing of information. We do know what is happening through the committees that we have put in place, Universal Service and Access Committee. But at African level, I think when we go for these coordination meetings, we can share because there's a lot to be shared.
Thank you.
Across meetings. Thank
you. Sarah, did you have something to add? I don't know whether this is what it says.
Okay, I can just say for working together as sub-regional group, I think we have had opportunities where we've met and talked about the issues, the challenges we face, but I think we can do more. I think we can be more deliberate in what we're doing to actually address specific problems. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. We do have a poll that was taken, and the question was whether universal access was working well, good results are being seen, and 4% say good results are being seen. And the other one, working okay, but there is room for improvement, 48%. Not working well, it needs a rethink, 48%. I thank you very much and hand back to Dan.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you again to all our panelists as well. So to Sarah, Mauli, and to Tony. So again, really fascinating discussion, and I think it's great to hear what's going on in all the different regions. And yeah, really, really great. So thank you all so much for your involvement and for the participation there. So thank you. So that's it today now for the plenary sessions, but we do now have our 3 showcase sessions running. So as I mentioned before, we have 3 showcase sessions running today. So we have a showcase session which is on showcase stage 1, which is going to be hosted by a GSMA, and that showcase session is looking at improving connectivity in Sub-Saharan Africa, and how effective spectrum licensing can set the stage for better digitalization. On showcase stage 2, the session we have running there is hosted by a SOA and is looking at whether spectrum is the answer to Africa's connectivity questions. And on showcase stage 3, we have a session there being hosted by Intel, which is going to be providing a demo of Wi-Fi 6E. So those 3 showcase sessions are all going to be starting in just a couple of minutes over on the showcase stage. So a reminder how to get there. You need to click on the stages button on the left-hand menu bar. You'll see then the options for the stages, and you can choose for showcase stage 1, 2, or 3. So those will be starting in just a couple of minutes. And then tomorrow, we have the last day of the conference tomorrow. So starting actually an hour earlier tomorrow. So do set your calendar reminders for an hour earlier tomorrow. We're starting at 10 a.m. Central African time. And we're going to be moving on to look at 5G. So we're going to be focusing, the whole of the morning session is going to be on 5G, looking at key hopes, plans, expectations for 5G, and then actually having a session, a continuation of a session we've had for the last couple of years at this conference, where we're bringing together various stakeholders to look at the path towards a harmonized strategy for 5G in Africa. So some fascinating discussions on 5G in the morning, and then in the afternoon we're going to be looking at where priorities should lie for regulators in bringing spectrum to market, looking at the different bands and different options for that. And finally, we have our final It's a Wrap session. So we're closing ceremony, and Andrew is going to be rejoining us for that and giving us some closing remarks, alongside the chairman of the regulator of Ict in Mauritius as well, which is great to have them involved in that as well. And we do have a final Have Your Say session. So as well, there's a last opportunity for you all to also get involved in the discussion. But once again, I'd like to thank you all for your participation, and a massive thank you to Andrew and to all of our speakers and panelists for the sessions this afternoon, and of course to the panelists and speakers in the earlier sessions as well. So please do now make your way over to the showcase sessions. They'll be starting in just a minute or so, and then have a lovely evening following that. Enjoy the showcase, have a lovely evening after that, and looking forward to seeing you all back here tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. Bye.